AI's in a little bit of trouble. Like, people don't love it. Some people hate it.
We need to show people how this is going to make a difference.
Potentially could die in DC if you don't get this right.
There should be national safety standards.
How worried are you that if something bad happens, that the government just seizes control of these companies? I've known you forever as like a political savant. Like you think about political campaigning. If AI were a candidate, like AI's in a little bit of trouble. Like, people don't love it. Some people hate it. If I were running a campaign next year, I'd run an anti-robot, anti-AI campaign, go all in. You're starting to see this in Maine and other places. How worried are you about that?
Look, I think that, we're at a point in AI where if you're using your candidate analogy, and I think of candidates that I've done who've been in a similar place where, like, you're sort of famous but not well known, and there's a real imperative to sort of fill that cup in terms of becoming well known, but to do it in a way that demonstrates the actual value proposition for like everyday normal people. I mean, it's interesting when you're sort of talking, I think, a little bit below the question is like what polling would show and sentiment and that type of stuff. A lot of this, frankly, depends a little bit on how you ask the question, right? If you ask the question, should the U.S. continue to lead on AI? Like, the answers are fairly overwhelming. If you ask the question, can AI be a catalyst for reindustrializing the country? Like, you get huge support there. But you are right. People are concerned about how this is going to impact them in terms of their economics, their jobs, their kids. Are they paying more in energy prices? And I think those are all things that, we in the AI sector absolutely need to take on an answer. And I do think, amongst the challenges in this whole space has been the conversation up till, I think, relatively recently has been fairly binary. On one side, there is, an acceleration argument that, hey, this is going to be the greatest thing ever. We're all going to be Bob Ross and painting in watercolors by our homes in on the ocean in Maine.
Right.
And there's nothing to worry about here. And then on the other extreme, sort of this doomer view, which is that this is such a powerful technology, it should only be controlled by a very small number of folks. Look, I'm ultimately, and I know OpenAI is ultimately a believer in humanity and humans' ability to make really good decisions about stuff. And so I think our approach has always been, let's actually try to make these decisions through a small d democratic process. I do think we need to show people how this is going to make a difference in their lives, right? The scientific advances that you're going to make, the healthcare advances that you're going to make. Every kid in the world could have a tutor that helps them with their education. And, what we have seen thus far, obviously on the economic front, is that if you use this the right way, this is scaling the ability of humans to do things that then make them more productive. But who gets to participate in those productivity gains? And I do think that that's an important part of the conversation and something that we're actually going to be wanting to talk about here in this place.
I always think about things of just like if I walked into my dive bar at Axios, Wisconsin, what would they say? And if say, are you scared shitless about AI eating your job or doing something twisted to your kids? It'd be like a large number of people say, yes, I am scared. And then I think about the people who are the faces of it, like with all due respect to Sam or to Elon or to Dario. They do talk in these like dramatic, change the world, could eat the world, could have a world where Elon talks about you never have to work. And most people are like, I kind of want to work. So is the candidate, using that analogy, do we need a different candidate? Like, who can actually say that?
I think it's, what's the old line? I mean, this goes back to, I think, the 1930s, a version of, is there a chicken in every pot, right? And ultimately what that line was getting at is, did you as that person in the bar in Oshkosh or the person in the bar in Portland, Maine, do they actually see something in this that is in their economic interest that's good for their families? And, I think one of the interesting things that you do see in the data is the distinction between those who are using this technology and those who are not. Those who are using it, regardless of their economic scale. And look at, OpenAI has, nearly 1 billion people using our tech on a regular basis. So we obviously see a ton of information. Those who are using it, have a pretty positive view of it because they are understanding how this is a tool that scales their abilities. Those who are not using it, I think, tend to have, a more questioning view of it. Now, every day that goes on, obviously, more people are going to be using it, more today than the day before, more tomorrow than today. So some of that is going to evolve. But I do think, a lot of this is how do you actually show people that they're going to benefit from it, that they have an economic interest in this. People do need to feel like that they're going to have a piece of this and participate in it. And to your point, like, you can't talk beyond people or above people. You need to talk with people and involve them in the conversation.
I think about AI being born in Silicon Valley out west. In some ways, it potentially could die in DC if you don't get this right? Like either it could get snuffed out by politics, it could get snuffed out by regulation. You're not there now, but how much do you worry about that? How much is having 100 people here to make sure that doesn't happen?
Yeah, I think from our perspective, and this is something we've talked about before, but AI is really the first technology in the modern times that is a dual-use technology that is primarily being built by the private sector and not the public sector.
Yeah.
And as we move forward, I think one of the things that is absolutely critical as we start to develop new ways of how the public sector and private sector can actually work together in terms of both the development and in particular the deployment of this technology. Some of that just begins with the pedagogy, right? Educating folks on what this is and what it isn't. But I do think we are getting to a place where you're going to need to start to come up with ideas that are policy ideas and ways of working together on policy that are as transformative as the underlying technology itself is. This office is not the solution to it, but we are putting this office here to actually be a convening center to help facilitate those kinds of conversations.
You were talking about, you feel like we're in about the third chapter in the trilogy to date of AI. Walk through that.
Yeah, and if you go back and look at like general purpose technologies, and those are things like the wheel, the combustion engine, electricity, they typically go through some version of these chapters where you go from the technology coming out, people becoming apprehensive of it, people becoming power users of it, and then people really embracing it. That has been, an historic pattern.
Yeah.
Now, I do think you have seen three distinct chapters in AI with us entering the beginning of the third chapter. The first chapter were frontier labs like OpenAI actually demonstrating that they could build and deploy artificial intelligence systems that were generally reliable and generally safe. That was chapter one. Chapter two was actually building tools, whether it was chat or agentic tools that people were actually able to build off of, particularly if you were a power user like yourself. I think we are now entering chapter three, which at some level also gets at some of the questions that you have been asking about, where it is beginning to become apparent, certainly at a sovereign national level, I think at a commercial business level, and I think increasingly at an individual level, that this is indeed an infrastructure technology. I mean, think about it as a utility for intelligence. If you had electricity, you created utilities to make electricity broadly accessible, right? And people began to understand that if I could plug something in and build something off of that, I could do incredible things. And I think you are beginning to see us enter that period where folks are beginning to understand that this is an infrastructure utility type of technology. We, OpenAI, certainly think of ourselves as, in effect, building an intelligence utility for the world that's going to make intelligence closer, more accessible. I mean, we almost think about it in really simple terms. Can you build an intelligence that's accessible, that's cheap, and that's abundant, so that as many people as possible, not just a few, but the many, can actually build things off of this?
A couple of policy things quick as we wrap. It's not totally clear what the White House wants in terms of a first look. It looks like it's not going to be FDA-like. I think that was out there in terms of like a firm regulatory environment where it's required. Is that your understanding? And is there anything that you've heard from the White House that they want that you guys wouldn't be fine with?
No, I mean, look at this a lot of the conversation that has been taking place, I do think builds off of, frankly, where we have been on this. I mean, as you know, we already do a partnership with the Center for AI Strategic Institute, KC. And what we do with them is they test our our models before we deploy them or release them. As we began this conversation, dual use technology, we need to develop new muscles. You can certainly see a direction of government where the public and the private, the labs and the government, increasingly are working more closely together, on this, both to evaluate the strengths of these systems, the capabilities of them, in a way that ideally is not going to impact or degrade the innovation or the pace of the innovation, but in a way that puts the government, in a strong position to know what the capabilities are, so that the government, within the democratic system, is in the best position possible to think about what's in the best interest of the public. So I do think that at some level that is the direction of travel broadly here. I think we have also advocated for there should be national safety standards, right? We should make those required. If you can't get them because of the absence of progress at the federal level, can you start to do what New York and California have done, which is sort of create state views that mirror one another? Illinois is beginning to consider something like that. And maybe you get a reverse federalism to sort of, in effect, create
Would you oppose the CIA and other parts of the federal government having to approve the release of every model before it's released?
I think, like with all of these things, you got to see what the details are and the specifics, of all of that. I do think that, and Sam has said this, like we do live in a democracy. You do need to engage and work through the democratic processes on this. As a stakeholder in this, we're certainly going to express our views, but ultimately, you do have to find new muscles on all of this stuff. I think that this is going to go beyond, and again, something that you guys have talked a lot about. But people always talk about public-private partnerships. I think this is probably going to go beyond what sort of the conventional definition of a public-private partnership is, and really start to have
it should be like a new kind of organization.
But that also comes back, Jim, to like this utility concept, right? I mean, if you think about this as a global or even a national level, you are going to need to begin to sort of integrate those. I mean, look, I think we've done something that I think is interesting, which is, we are a nonprofit that oversees a public benefits corporation.
Right.
And I think, all those examples of general purpose technologies, you often saw changes in corporate structures so that you were optimizing for the democratization or the widely distributed benefits of that technology. The S corporation at some level helped create the ability to do infrastructure investment. Limited liability corporations allowed railroads to be built in the UK.
Right.
Utilities allowed electricity and water to be dispersed at an affordable rate. Do we need to sort of create corporate structures that actually build in democracy by design? And then is there a way that you integrate that with the government? I mean, I sort of think about this as maybe it's not the public sector, maybe it's not the private sector, maybe there's some type of common sector that gets developed out of that. And I think what you're seeing with Casey and ACs around the country, what you're seeing maybe in some of the conversations taking place right now around cyber is, the beginning of steps in that direction as we build that out, a pace with the speed of the innovation. And again, not to belabor this, but we did do this national industrial policy, which effectively said, like, we do need to begin to build out some of these systems, given where this technology is going.
You can end on this. How worried are you that if something bad happens, a cyber attack, or China catches up on the technology and can start to do things on the national defense side, that the government just seizes control of these companies? This is too much. You guys are too risky to the national security of this company. That feels like that could happen. That could be an existential risk to your business model.
I mean, I guess I have a lot of confidence that, we do live in a democracy, and, broadly defined elected officials who get elected through the democratic process are going to make the right decisions on behalf of the country. I mean, a little bit of this goes, I think, and not, not to be, I'm not trying to be overly optimistic about this. I do try to be, a realist. But we and certainly myself have a lot of faith in like the ability of us to figure this stuff out. I certainly think that there are going to be bumps along the road. I mean, that is, you don't have to be a faux historian. You could actually be a real historian and go back and track those. But I also think humans are pretty good at being able to figure these things out and ultimately do it in a way that, really does lead to broad-based benefits. And I'm super confident. I mean, you actually had if I could, I'm going to tout one of the pieces that you wrote. You wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago that was sort of in the context of high school graduations.
Yeah.
And, I shared it with my two boys. It was a really inherently optimistic view with a dose of realism, about the world. But I think what really appealed to me about your piece was that it was a fundamental affirmation that people can, in the collective, make pretty good decisions, and that this country is pretty damn special.
Yeah.
And that, the good people of this country and what makes this country special will figure this stuff out.
I do, if they're informed. I guess my biggest worry is like, who's going to step up and inform them, right?
Yeah.
The colleges aren't doing a great job of it. I think companies kind of have to step up. I really do think business leaders are the only entity right now. Government can't do it. It could be too slow, and you guys were too busy building the technology. So it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah. And look, I think all of those parties do. I mean, maybe that's some, not to put words in your mouth, but some version of how you start to think about like this common sector, right? Where, I mean, I do think there's something in the public benefits corporation structure, right? And public benefits corporation means you don't have to optimize for purely shareholder return, right? You can consider a bunch of stakeholders. And that, I certainly believe that, amongst the things we do need to think about is, do we think about those corporate structures that then incentivize, those different entities being able to participate?
And you could set that up to solve for how do you spread the wealth, right? There's a way to
100%.
structure that where the American people are a shareholder, right?
So even in our example, right, almost 30% of our company is now owned by the nonprofit, right? That nonprofit will be distributed, to the broader public in different ways. But there's certainly other ways you could think about that. We put this in our national industrial policy, right? Does the public potentially have, direct stakes in this? Do you create some version of, what exists in Alaska, the Alaska Permanent Fund, where the public is to participate in the natural resources and how they generate, right? Is there a way to do that? Do you think about an AI or intelligence dividend, where the broader public gets to participate? There's different ways that you could think about that. It's ultimately thinking about how are you making sure that you're balancing capital and labor within the social contract. But those are all, those are all like really interesting and exciting things that, if we get right, really means that this can have an incredible impact. That's why, not to bring it back, but it's it's a reason why we have this office here, to have these conversations.
Perfect. Appreciate it, Chris.
Okay. Thank you, sir.